Welcome to Going Green podcast number 6 special. This is sort of an extra one we've sort of inserted in because we're looking at whether the UK is less well prepared for global change than it was 5 years ago. This week, there's a rather damning report's come out.
Yeah, here we go. Here it is. And for
the podcast, you could, how many?
142-page report on how prepared, or at least in regards to the assessment of how prepared we are for climate change, and so we can set. And so it's basically, so this is how you've done over the last 5 years, and this is what you need to do for the next 5 years to prepare ourselves for, or to decrease the risk of climate change, or prevention rather than.
Yeah, so this climate change risk assessment is carried out every 5 years. It's a lengthy report, as you said, and it's reviewing how well the country is prepared for basically climate change, which everyone's accepting is sort of going on. And then this report is looked at by the government, and
then policy is set by it, and that's how things are. Anyway, so the last 5 years ago, they did this assessment and they came out with a bunch of things, and that's none the wiser. But this year, the assessment for this of last year came and said the targets that were set last year, or the last 5 years ago, they haven't been met, and worse, the not the report, but the actual everything, the policies or the climate change has gotten worse. As in, let's say 5 years ago they said, oh, you need X amount of coastal flooding. Well, actually, flooding's now got worse. So suddenly you now need to put an additional amount on top of what you previously said. It's basically doing that adaptive sort of, looking at risk. So anyway. But that's what the report is looking at, and the advice to the government to set policy and all those sorts of things.
So we're looking at something like basically about 10 major changes.
Well, they go through and they write, here are the 10 biggest problems that the UK is looking through climate change. These are looking at things that are problems that are going to take place. This is things like the flooding and the sorts of things. Interesting fact, like the sea level in the last 5 years has risen, was it 5 centimeters?
It's gone up. Yeah, they were talking in decades, weren't they? Having read the report, they were talking about increased flooding, increased drought, and things have got worse over the last few years, and basically some people need to do something about it.
Yeah, so it's looking at what the threats are and looking what the risks are to then work out how to prevent, how to secure these things.
So let's have a quick look at the report. And the first bit is sort of, they talk about freshwater habitats and the fact that with global warming, things are changing, so we're losing some of our sort of species and habitats.
Biodiversity.
Yeah, and it's going down. And we're looking at probably drier summers and wetter winters. So we've got to look at how things are sort of changing. They're trying to put in things like, well, just flood defences as well, but they're looking at how they can move animals from one place for another.
Yeah, because it's one of the things where they sort of how the animals are adapting to the new climate or the new temperatures, etc. And the answer is they're not.
No.
So we're now looking at, to protect that biodiversity, how do we do this? And it's silly things like increased shading in rivers. It's minor things which don't seem much, but it actually helps so much. They talk about fishing passages, in rivers and things, or not through dams, but they talk about so that fish can actually move up and down rivers away
Yeah.
from the heat. And it's those sorts of odd things that are what they're actually saying. You know, because you've got to remember at the end of this, right? The government's got to make policy, right? They make laws and they do things, and it's sort of they're looking at all these things, and they're looking about all right. So coming in the next couple of years, of course, you've got lots of different all the regional. I say regional. The
National.
No, it's not the national. I forgot what the devolved powers. There you go. See, I knew it was something.
Yeah.
And they're looking at each individual devolved government's policy
And
or
responsibility.
and responsibility on things. So, in England, you've got the sort of environmental bill, you've got the natural recovery network, environmental land management scheme. You've got all these schemes that are happening. But, you've got the Northern Ireland one, which is the All Ireland Pollination Plan and, strategic peatland strategy and those sorts of things. In Scotland, you've got the forest strategy, environmental, all these different strategies, but they individually should take on.
They need to work together, don't they?
It's not they need to work together. They need to say these are the things they need to change their policies in reflection of this report.
Yeah, because the next one was the risk to soil health and increased flooding and drought. And they're talking about there, more tree planting, trying to cover between, from 13%, which we got today, up to 18% by 2050. And 5% doesn't sound an awful lot, but that is an awful lot of trees.
An awful lot of trees, exactly. And so, this is where, although the powers are devolved, they actually sort of need to come together to work out sort of, where things, because nature does not know borders. We know that through other
Yep.
things, but so that's the thing. But there are other things that could happen. It's the agricultural output of things, I'm not saying Scotland's very good on their agricultural product because obviously all the Highlands not very good for growing. But but we can't say for that. But it's looking at how you manage and all these things and adapting and changing current policy to reflect
Yeah.
new policy.
Well, you're saying one thing doesn't fit all. What fits England doesn't fit Scotland and Wales. And so that's why we got the devolved governments to try and do that. They're looking at the risks to crops and livestock, commercial trees from, they say, multiple climate hazards. So it is just not just global warming that's having the effect, but in fact, sea level rises, rainfall changes. It is just this changing climate, like heat stress, drought risk. But there again, the other way, looking at waterlogging, flooding, and as we've seen, more fires. And then, of course, what do you do about the pests? And how about extra diseases? And they may or may not be related to global warming, but it's again things that you've actually got to worry about and plan for.
Yeah, and this is where it is a problem. It is to plan for all those disruptions that are being caused. It needs to be looked at and say, and I'm thinking silly things like floodplain, bridges over floodplain. We saw, what was that? It was in famous one where the water went over the bridge and it was middle of the town and suddenly nothing can go through because the bridge was low enough or the water was high that it actually breached the bridge.
Yeah.
And suddenly that's a problem. You see, that's a disruption. But you think, oh, that's just a simple road. But how many roads do you hear on the side of the road that say likely to flood?
And we're seeing more of those.
And we're seeing more of those, and the floods are getting worse. So suddenly, on major roads, that disruption, is a major impact. And, I'm not saying how much loss of, our economic output is there, but, it's something they need to look at, something you need to look into. It's this is what this trying to say is sort of it's trying to make aware of these problems to look at.
Well, I know I've had that problem just driving up the road. What looked like well, I didn't even know there was a little river there, but one day wasn't so much a a little river there, but a very large sort of lake that we were having to sort of try and cross. So good fun. Um, and it's a case of things like COVID-19 also, it brings to the fore various other problems that we hadn't thought about. Some actions are taken by business. They've sort of now gone more sort of working from home.
Yeah.
Whereas not many people used to work from home. Now we've got an awful lot more people working from home. And if you've got heavy snow or you've got floods or something, then it's ever so easy just to switch to your company and say, right, we'll be online for.
Yeah, exactly. So changes and adaptation is the important thing. It's not that we need to change; it's that we need to make sure that we've got things to adapt things. Having this is like the having the policy, the work policy of having this work from home. And unfortunately, that has problems elsewhere. Think of all the cafes that rely on all the office workers who are now working from home. Suddenly, the cafes need to be where the people are at home.
Yeah.
It's a massive problem. You see, they don't get away from the office and working from home. That's the problem. But that's the adaptation that needs to now take place. They need to now be able to go from working at or catering to the businesses there at the office. So they're going to be able to. We need to cater to the same office workers, just in a different location. So that's the whole crux of the thing, is to look at this adaptation.
Yeah. Power is also another one that we're seeing more and more power being used by everyone. Instead of having power in offices, now we're having to have the power and all the extra stuff like heating and that in houses. So it's requiring perhaps more electricity. And we're moving, of course, more to wind. And we're talking about in the news this week that by 2025, we're going to have sort of almost net zero.
Yeah, all the power is going to be generated by renewables as
Yeah.
opposed to needing.
Except on a not a very windy day.
Well, they said they wanted to be almost run by.
Yeah.
They want to have the capacity to run, as opposed to saying we are running, because of course, when it's not windy, when it's not sunny, they're not going to get all the renewables, which is the problem. So yeah, it's a challenging thing.
But we're also looking, as you were talking yesterday to me, about changes in electricity supply. We're now starting to put more of the national grid underground. And that means that the maintenance.
Yeah, there's less maintenance, or the cost of maintenance is lower, which helps that way. And so they don't have to maintain all the power lines and things, and economics gain or economic not.
But it's not just this country that has the problem. Of course, other countries do. I was talking to a friend of mine this morning, and we're doing a video conference across the world, and he's sitting in his car. And why is he sitting in his car? He said, well, we haven't got any electricity. And he said that goes on normally for sort of 3 or 4 days. And so the only place he can charge his phone and actually do a video conference was sitting in his car.
Yeah. And that's the problem, you see. Suddenly you've got these things of the power outages, and that needs to be resilient. You need to build a system that's resilient. And unfortunately, we're fortunate enough, we have got a national grid where we have got some resilience in. But this report is saying we need more.
Yeah.
It needs to be looked at. You need to increase the resilience of the system rather than just keeping it sort of where it is. It needs to go up. The critical infrastructure is, it's important to maintain, but also it needs to adapt.
One of the things I found interesting, they were talking about the risk to human health and well-being, and they talked about the increased exposure to heat. And something we do in this country, we very much look at trying to keep the houses warm. In the winter, it's cold. We have all these government grants to sort of insulate your house and do this, that, and the other. But if we're getting hotter summers, then very little is actually done at the moment on cooling houses down.
Yeah, we're built for, our houses are made of bricks. They're meant to keep the heat in rather than. But you look at other countries, they are got timber frames. They let heat out because of course they're trying to let the heat out. So you compare to the others, sort of like why is a lot of American houses built out of wood, and you sort of go, the answer is because they've got to let the heat out rather than we're here. It's to keep the heat in. But as you say, because we're getting hotter summers, I wouldn't say hotter winters either. That's the wrong way to grasp it, but I think it is true.
I think we're just going to get wetter
Yeah,
winters.
I think that suddenly you need to go and work out, right, we need to start ventilating houses better.
And there's and I think builders could do this, but until the regulations are changed, then no one's going to bother to do it. And they say, well, why am I going to bother to do this? Because there aren't any regulations that say what we're going to do, and that's where it's down to the government to actually decide what
Exactly.
will be the problems there. We know when we went on holiday quite a few years ago, we went in a real heat wave. We went to France, and then there was quite a lot of deaths in France due to heat. And we could be looking at that same sort of problem happening here in just a few years' time if we don't do something like that. Multiple risks from the UK from climate changes of impact overseas.
Yeah, so they looked about, obviously, you've got the UK impacts, but what if there's a flood in China? Bizarre things, but, and that disruption, of course, that's built into the system, but obviously, that's a supply chain problem where you're going to get your food and your goods and all sorts of things. Yeah. And so basically, it's a sort of not globalism, but we need to not rely necessarily on one country to produce the things. How much timber do we get from I was Scandinavia? I was going to say Sweden, but it's not. It's Scandinavian timber, you see, right? And we get quite a lot. And currently, there's a problem with inflation, with there's so much shortage of timber and those sorts of things. So now we need to look at where else can we get timber from, or the same type of timber, those sorts of things. And this resilience, or these things need to be looked at, and it's an opportunity to adapt. It's an opportunity to look into the things before they get worse.
Yeah, when there have been some problems, then we've found we've lost lots of hard disks. They weren't being manufactured, therefore we sort of have a chip shortage. We have a hard disk shortage because we've got just sort of one supplier or one country doing the supplying.
Yeah. So
And
it's those things need to be looked at. Yeah, and this is what they're talking about. They're talking about looking at these things and you increase capacity, and also look at ways that us manufacturing, not necessarily mass manufacturing, but enough sort of to provide that critical infrastructure for these things.
yeah, we're talking about we're going to be the number one country for wind. Boris said we're going to be the Saudi Arabia for wind.
Yes.
Except we actually do virtually no manufacturing of wind turbines in this country.
I think we do the not the generator, but the I think it's the inverter. It's just one of
We
those.
do a few bits. Yeah, we need to be more self-reliant as a country, and that needs to be sort of put into policy to sort of
Exactly.
make sure that that sort of thing's going to work. Basically, we've got to avoid what we call lock-in.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you avoid if you avoid that lock in of sorts of things, then you can actually do this adapt, and you can spark all sorts of changes in the economy to help prevent things from going wrong.
One of the things I looked there, the report looks at preparing for the unpredictable, and that almost sounds like a thing that you can't do, which is to prepare for something you can't predict. But you can think about sort of what would happen in great extremes, and we're seeing more extremes in weather. We're seeing that probably this country is going to hit probably 4 degrees in the next sort of 80 years.
Yeah,
Not my lifetime, but when you're my age, you're going to be looking at this problem that it's going to be 4 degrees warmer. And that's not a problem for you because you can swim quite well.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is the thing, if, you need to look at sort of, well, in the last decade, sea levels have risen by 5 centimeters, or in any sort of like, or the next decade, or even the next 5 decades, you add 5 centimeters up, slowly it's approaching a meter very rapidly. And suddenly places that were not underwater, but were sort of at sea level at the minute or risk of flooding are now going to be above water, or below the waterline, because of course that's where the waterline now exists. It's a meter higher. So
The phrase, I think, is slowly, slowly, then suddenly.
yeah, exactly. So it's a critical thing that it needs to happen, but we are looking at things becoming, as you say, how many hurricanes? You take the example, how many was it F5? I think they go up in
Yeah, F5 now or above.
or
Yeah.
hurricanes there have been. Previously you see there's whole range, and they only hit 1 or 2 a season. Now we're looking at a season containing sort of nearly 80% more F5 and less of the lower class of hurricanes.
And that, of course, affects our supply chain. If we're expecting stuff from someplace, then we're not going to get it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's doing these sort of things are, I say, getting worse, but things are getting harder to predict. But the extremes are now becoming the norms.
Yeah.
And so we need to now look, well, if the extremes are now the norms, then what's the super extreme, the next further extreme than sort of the current extreme? Because, of course, when those things happen, they're going to be absolutely devastating.
So something there you mentioned really is something called threshold effect. I know from being doing the biology that when you get water temperature lower than 17 Celsius, it's fine. But you get river water above 17, suddenly it all goes green as you get these big algal blooms. And that suddenly ruins your sort of water system. And just that little tipping point of 1 degree going from perhaps 16 to 17 can make all the difference.
Yeah, exactly. And we need to know, we need to keep monitoring and sort of looking at these things and identifying how do we prevent, let's say it goes up to that 17, how do we prevent that water stream being full of things like, the algal bloom, all these sorts of things. The answer is, well, unfortunately, there are ways to get rid of the algal bloom, but of course you also want to keep the biodiversity in, which means,
But it's preparing for some of those things, isn't it?
exactly.
Really?
It's preparing and making sure we understand what's going to happen and what's a small change could do to the environment and be able to react to that change.
Yeah. Climate change is going to widen existing inequalities. If you thought, the things were bad now, you're going to find that if you're sort of exposed to a flood, then you're not be able to get insurance for that, and which means then when you get more floods, it's going to make you poorer and poorer, and you can't sell because your house is flooded. And who's going to want to buy that? And they're not going to want to buy your house until flood defenses are put in place, so you're not going to lose your house. So we've got to try and work out, well, the government's got to do this, how to avoid unfairly disadvantaging the future generations, to make sure that some are going to be more worse off than others. We're looking at people living in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have higher annual damages than those living in England.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of those small things where you don't think about it, but you do. You sort of, how many, they're all in the hills. Well, I'm not talking about Scotland, and the more hilly areas, and they do have problems associated with the rivers and the flooding. And suddenly you go, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Of course, all is doom and gloom. There is also this idea of opportunities that you can actually get from all this climate change. we're going to look at perhaps reduced winter heating costs, which, is going to be good. And you've got to think about what you can do in the market for sort of being one of these first movers to sort of get into this new business, saying, well, look, if we're looking at hotter climates, the UK becoming hotter, should I be in sort of now not investing in, but creating my own air conditioning company so I can start selling that to people? I'm not a great fan of air conditioning because I look at how much that's actually putting a strain on the electricity grid.
Yeah, but you can look at it and you can see, well, why not passive air conditioning? See, that's even better. Yeah, that's a good idea that way.
Yeah.
Because it makes sense. You only use it when you need it. Yeah, but being on board as the first ones onto this, suddenly when when the regulations change, all these sorts of things, suddenly, yes, you're there, but you can actually move and actually do things with it, rather than just letting it sort of, the opportunity slip by, you know. So, all this doom and gloom, not necessarily all doom and gloom, because it's all about how do we adapt to things.
Yeah.
And,
But it is funding to a certain extent. If the government put in funding for certain things, like they're prepared to back sort of new emerging technologies to do something, then people will actually do that.
yeah, exactly. So, this is what the report is stating is all about but it's nice to see this is what the advice of the government is. So we know this is what they're looking at. This is what they're looking at doing. And suddenly you can say, oh, there might be an opportunity there where I can work with the government, or more precisely, the government then funds opportunities, and you sort of, that's how you get into the market, you see. And it's all a win-win in regards to everything. You're making money, you're having resilience, adapt, and the government's getting those targets of saying, look, we're adapting, and it's all a win-win. So it is that one of those things where the funding and the looking at these things, it's an important thing to look through, but it's not sort of, disastrous. But I was just hearing that thunder. Ooh.
But we've got to be prepared for all these changes. We know these changes are coming. We know the climate has changed over recent decades. We know it's going to change more. We know that we've got to make changes. And I think as a population that we've got to be prepared to start doing these things, even if the government isn't doing it.
Exactly. So, you sort of look what you can do, but you've got to do the risk assessment of where you are. If you're in a flood zone or a floodplain, the flooding is going to increase. Therefore, you need to look at flood defenses and looking how you can do those flood defenses.
Yeah.
Or flood prevention risk. We're talking about, do you build a sacrificial first floor or a ground floor, technically?
And that's just building houses differently, building them prepared for whatever's going to come. And we just have to sort of worry about some of those things. So this report sort of goes on for, as you said, some sort of
142 pages.
142 pages, which some of it's quite interesting. There's lots of interesting graphs in there and suggestions that the government ought to be doing this, that, and the other.
And it slowly we'll go through sort of, look through these and see snippets and sort of all sorts of loveliness. But it's one of those things where it is such a good, it's a good report. It's a large report. It's a 5 years worth of reporting.
Yeah.
So
what was noticeable by looking at the report is that if you divide the report into 3 categories, the red, the amber, and the green, there's not much green.
Yes,
there's a little bit of amber, and there's an enormous amount of red.
Yes, so the answer, the policy looks at sort of where do we come from, where we're going. What have we changed for the better, and what hasn't changed, and what desperately does need changing. Sort of setting a priority list, and the answer is The greens is what has changed and what we are prepared for, and also things very small amounts. And the amber and the reds categories just increased. They're just piling on. Things that were amber are now going red, and obviously things that are red now are more increasing in priority that need to be changed and things need to be done. And that's what we need to step up. But it's also we need to start moaning and groaning at the government to sort of say, this report's come out. This is you haven't been doing your job.
Yeah.
Get people in.
Well, I think we better stop there as our half hour is just about up. So thank you for listening, and we'll be back next time when we'll have a look at another topic about going green. Thank you for listening. Goodbye from me.
And apparently bye from you.
Still got it wrong.
I still got it wrong.
Bye-bye.
Right, bye.